So the first example of imperialism that we're going to take a look at are the effects that the British had in South Africa. All right, now, a successive series of droughts in the late 1800s forced several small chiefdoms in southern Africa to band together for water sources, and the most successful was the Zulu Empire, led by Shaka. Shaka organized a standing army made up of various clans and made them loyal to him and not their clan. And promotion was based on merit rather than social standing, so if it sounds like the Mongols, that's because that's exactly what Genghis Khan used to build up his forces. In many cases, Shaka violently absorbed chiefdoms into his empire, but others willingly submitted and became Zulu. Other leaders sought to copy Shaka's tactics and create empires of their own, while many interior societies fled and abandoned their lands. Now, it was during this time that the descendants of mainly Dutch settlers known as Boers moved into these newly unoccupied territories, so there is a Dutch presence. Now, the British presence in southern Africa was relatively new, because they had only recently acquired Cape Town from the Dutch after the Napoleonic Wars. They really only cared about the security of Cape Town and protecting the maritime route to India. But they had to deal with the frontier, where the Boers searched for land. They resented the British occupation, and the Boers will clash with African societies. Now, the Boers never completely subdued African resistance, but the British will have no problem doing so. British firepower will overwhelm the Xhosa. All right, this is pronounced Xhosa, and they lost grazing lands. Some Xhosa even converted to Christianity and took up settled agriculture, leading some to believe that they had abandoned their traditions. Now, there was resistance to British rule, and this is exemplified first in the Xhosa cattle killing movement. Now, in the 1850s, a cattle disease that was inadvertently introduced by Europeans killed off very large numbers of Xhosa cattle. With the pressures of starvation and invasion, the Xhosa referred to the prophecies of a young woman who said that if they slaughtered their remaining cattle, their ancestors would return and purge the evil from their land, and the cattle would emerge anew from the ground. The belief in ancestors and the power of certain women to communicate them was traditional to the Xhosa, so many followed this advice and killed their cattle. And this is often called the Xhosa cattle killing of 1856 to 1857, and it contributed to the loss of over 100,000 lives via hunger. The survivors of the famine were absorbed into Britain's Cape Colony. Now, the Zulu retained their sovereignty into the 1870s. British authorities issued an ultimatum for the Zulu to disband their regiments in 1879. And the Zulu did win a key battle against the British, but it was kind of like the equivalent of Little Big Horn. It was sort of the last effort. The Zulu were successful in charging at the enemy in dense ranks. That's what marked their success in battle. But this was a bad idea when facing machine guns and cannon. And the British soon sacked the Zulu capital, and they gained access to the diamonds and gold that were on Zulu lands. These are two of the biggest resources that South Africa had to offer, diamonds and gold. Now, clashes between Brits and Boers stemmed from this guy, the imperialist Cecil Rhodes, and his ambition to build an empire from Cape to Cairo. And you can even see down here, the Rhodes Colossus, striding from Cape Town to Cairo. His British South African company had a private army to accomplish the task, and the Boers had already created several independent republics. But British recognition of these nations really didn't last all that long once gold was discovered in 1884. So essentially you have the Boer desire for independence versus Rhodes' desire for gold. And if you've ever heard of the Rhodes Scholar, that is a scholarship that's awarded based on an endowment from Rhodes. And Rhodes made his money in diamonds. De Beers Diamonds was the work of Cecil Rhodes, and it has a Dutch name because the diamond mines were discovered on Boer lands. Now, the British controlled the towns and railway lines, but the Boers blended into the population and launched guerrilla attacks in the country. The British put Boer civilians into what we would call concentration camps, and that's the first time this word was used. And over 20,000 Boers died of illness. Tens of thousands of Africans were caught in the middle, and they died as a result of this war. The two sides eventually compromised, and they formed the Union of South Africa in 1910, and they became a self-governing dominion under the British Empire. So essentially they were what Canada was. Both needed cheap African labor, hence the compromise. Now the Native Land Act was passed 3 years later by the all-white Parliament and limited Africans to reserves that included a fraction of their traditional lands. They wanted to strip Africans of their agricultural self-sufficiency and drive them to work in the mines and white farms for low pay. And this sets the stage for the process and series of laws known as apartheid. Settler colonies like South Africa experienced the pattern of restrictions on African landowning and cheap labor in European farms and mines. And these settler colonies would experience the most violence during the decolonization period following World War II that we'll explore as a part